At my son's promotion party, they introduced me as the babysitter. What happened next? At my son's promotion party, they introduced me as the babysitter. I smiled and took my seat. What happened next changed everything. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story travels. The ballroom at the Grand Riverside Hotel sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers. Servers moved gracefully between tables, carrying trays of champagne and appetizers. Laughter filled the room. Everywhere I looked, people were celebrating. And they should have been. My son, Daniel Parker, had just received the biggest promotion of his career. At 42 years old, he had become executive vice president of one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the Midwest. I should have felt nothing but pride. In many ways, I did. I had spent years imagining this moment, years imagining what it would feel like to watch my son achieve everything he had worked so hard for. Yet, as I stood near the entrance, clutching my small black handbag, something felt strangely wrong. Perhaps it was the way people glanced past me without recognition. Or maybe it was the way my daughter-in-law Vanessa seemed unusually nervous whenever someone approached us. I wasn't sure. Not yet. At 71 years old, I've learned to trust those small feelings, the quiet warnings that appear before a storm. Still, I pushed the thought aside. Tonight wasn't about me. It was Daniel's night. I had spent nearly an hour getting ready that afternoon, not because I cared about impressing anyone. Those days were long behind me, but because I wanted to look respectable. I chose a navy blue dress that Thomas, my late husband, always loved. The dress was nearly 10 years old, but it still fit comfortably. I carefully pinned a silver brooch to the collar, the same brooch Thomas had given me on our 25th wedding anniversary. As I looked in the mirror before leaving home, I found myself smiling. "You'd be proud of him," I whispered. For a moment, I could almost hear Thomas answering. Then the moment passed. The drive to the hotel took 40 minutes. The entire way there, I thought about Daniel as a little boy. The scraped knees, the school projects, the nights spent helping him study at the kitchen table. Back then, success seemed so far away. Back then, it was just the two of us trying to survive after Thomas passed away unexpectedly. I blinked away the memory as I entered the ballroom. A hostess greeted me politely and directed me toward the reception area. I expected to see Daniel. Instead, I found Vanessa. She stood near a group of executives, elegant as always in a cream-colored designer dress. Her smile was flawless. The kind of smile that looked perfect in photographs. The kind that never quite reached her eyes. "There you are, Eleanor," she said. Not Mom, not Daniel's mother, just Eleanor. She kissed the air beside my cheek and immediately turned her attention back to her guests. I told myself not to read too much into it. Vanessa had always been formal. Over the years, I'd grown accustomed to it. A few minutes later, a tall man approached our group. Judging by the way everyone greeted him, he was someone important. Very important. He extended his hand toward Vanessa. "Wonderful event," he said. "Thank you," Vanessa replied. Then the man glanced toward me. "And who might this be?" For a brief second, I waited. I expected Vanessa to say it. I expected her to smile proudly and say, "This is Eleanor Parker, Daniel's mother." Instead, she laughed. A light, effortless laugh. The kind designed to sound charming. "Oh," she said, waving her hand casually. "She's our babysitter." The world seemed to stop. Not completely. The music continued. People kept talking. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed nearby. But inside me, everything went silent. Our babysitter, not mother, not family, not the woman who had worked double shifts for 20 years to put Daniel through college. Just the babysitter. The man smiled politely. Another guest chuckled. Someone made a harmless joke about grandparents working overtime. Vanessa laughed again. I felt every pair of eyes drift away from me, as though I were invisible. For a moment, I simply stood there. Then, I smiled. The same calm smile I had practiced for years whenever life disappointed me. "Nice to meet you," I said quietly. No one noticed the tremor in my voice. No one except one man standing across the room. He hadn't laughed. He hadn't looked away. In fact, he was staring directly at me, and the expression on his face wasn't amusement. It was confusion, deep confusion, as though he knew something everyone else in the room didn't, as though he recognized me. A few seconds later, our eyes met. And that's when I realized something unexpected. The evening wasn't going to unfold the way Vanessa had planned. Not even close. I couldn't stop thinking about the man who had been watching me, the one who hadn't laughed, the one whose expression shifted from confusion to recognition the moment Vanessa called me the babysitter. I told myself it didn't matter. After all, the humiliation had already happened. One careless sentence had reduced an entire lifetime to a convenient label. But as I made my way toward the table assigned to me, I began noticing things I hadn't seen before. Small things. The kind of things that seem insignificant until they start forming a pattern. My table was near the back of the ballroom. Not completely hidden. Not close enough to be important. Just out of the way. Far from the stage. Far from Daniel. Far from the executives and senior leadership. I sat down slowly and glanced around. Most of the tables near the front were filled with company leaders, business partners, and close friends. Vanessa moved effortlessly among them, greeting everyone by name. She looked completely at home, like she belonged in that world. Perhaps she did. A waiter appeared beside me. "Champagne, ma'am?" I smiled politely and accepted a glass. The bubbles rose quietly to the surface. For several moments, I simply watched them. Sometimes silence feels safer than conversation, especially when you're trying not to cry. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly, I felt foolish. Foolish for being excited. Foolish for spending so much time preparing for a night that clearly wasn't meant to include me. A few guests filled the empty seats around my table. Most were spouses of employees. Pleasant people. Friendly enough. They chatted about vacations, golf memberships, and private schools. I listened politely, occasionally nodding, occasionally smiling. Nobody asked much about me, and honestly, I was grateful. I wasn't sure what I would have said. Eventually, the lights dimmed slightly. A spotlight illuminated the stage. The evening program was beginning. Applause filled the room as Daniel stepped onto the platform. My heart tightened. No matter what had happened earlier, he was still my son. And seeing him standing there brought back memories faster than I could stop them. I remembered a little boy sitting at our kitchen table struggling with multiplication. I remembered science fair projects built from cardboard and glue. I remembered football games where he spent more time on the bench than on the field. I remembered every disappointment, every victory, every scraped knee, every late-night conversation after Thomas died. For years, it had been just the two of us, Daniel and me, trying to figure out how to move forward after losing the man who held our family together. The applause pulled me back to the present. Daniel smiled confidently as the company's CEO introduced him. Everyone seemed impressed, and they should have been. He had worked hard, very hard. I would never deny that. But as I watched him accept congratulations, another memory surfaced, one I hadn't thought about in years. Daniel was 17. College acceptance letters had begun arriving. One evening, I found him sitting on the porch steps with his head in his hands. "I got in," he said quietly, "but we can't afford it." I still remembered the fear in his voice, the hopelessness, the way he avoided looking at me. That night, after he went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table for hours, running numbers, calculating expenses, trying to create money that didn't exist. 3 months later, I sold Thomas's pickup truck, the truck he'd loved, the truck I swore I'd never part with. The sale covered Daniel's first semester. I never told him. Not because I wanted gratitude, because that's what mothers do. We give things away quietly, sometimes so quietly that eventually people forget we ever gave them anything at all. A burst of laughter near the stage interrupted my thoughts. Vanessa was speaking with several executives. Daniel stood beside her, smiling, relaxed, successful. I studied them from across the room. Something about their body language bothered me. Not because they looked happy, because they looked comfortable. Comfortable without me. Comfortable pretending I wasn't part of the story. For years, I had ignored little moments, little comments, little exclusions. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself Vanessa was simply different from me. Different generation, different background, different personality. But sitting there alone at the back of that ballroom, I began seeing those moments differently. The missed invitations, the holiday dinner scheduled without telling me, the family photos where somehow I was always standing at the edge, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room. One memory led to another, like puzzle pieces clicking into place. And for the first time, I found myself asking a question I had spent years avoiding. Had this been happening all along? Had I been slowly removed from my own family one small step at a time? The thought sent a chill through me. I looked toward the stage again. Daniel was laughing at something Vanessa had said. Neither of them looked in my direction. Neither of them seemed to notice I was sitting alone. Then, just as the applause began again, I caught movement across the ballroom. The same man from earlier, the one who hadn't laughed. He was still watching me. This time, he wasn't confused. He looked certain. Certain enough that he started walking directly toward my table. And suddenly, for reasons I couldn't explain, I had the feeling that the evening was about to change. The man reached my table just as the applause began to fade. Up close, he looked to be in his late 60s, tall, silver-haired, confident in the way successful people often are after decades of experience. Yet there was something warm in his eyes, something familiar. "May I sit down?" he asked. I glanced at the empty chair across from me. Of course. He thanked me and took a seat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The program continued on stage, while guests listened attentively. Finally, he smiled. "I believe we've met before." I studied his face. There was something familiar about him, but I couldn't place it. "I'm afraid my memory isn't what it used to be." He laughed softly. "Mine isn't perfect either." Then he extended his hand. Robert Whitmore. The name immediately caught my attention. Everyone in the room knew who Robert Whitmore was. Founder of the company, CEO. The man responsible for building the entire organization from a small startup into a regional powerhouse. I shook his hand. "It's nice to meet you." His smile widened slightly. "No, Eleanor. We've met before." The way he said my name made me pause. Most people in this room didn't know my name. Most people probably thought I really was the babysitter. Yet Robert seemed completely certain. He leaned back in his chair. "About 15 years ago." I frowned. He continued. "A high school scholarship fundraiser. Suddenly, the memory surfaced. A community event. A crowded banquet hall. A charity program helping students from working-class families attend college." I blinked. "You were there." Robert nodded. "And so were you." The memory became clearer. Daniel had just finished high school. I had spent months filling out scholarship applications with him, driving across town after work, gathering documents, writing essays, doing everything possible to help him get into college. At that fundraiser, I remembered standing near the back of the room, feeling completely out of place among business leaders and donors. "Much like tonight," Robert smiled. "I remember because your son gave a speech." A lump formed in my throat. Daniel had been so nervous. His hands shook the entire time. I remember that. He talked about his mother for almost 10 minutes. I looked down at my hands. For reasons I couldn't explain, Those words hurt more than Vanessa's comment earlier, because I remembered that speech too. Back then, Daniel wasn't embarrassed by me. Back then, he proudly told anyone who would listen how hard I had worked, how many sacrifices I'd made, how I never gave up on him. Robert seemed to notice the change in my expression. His voice softened. He was very proud of you. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The ballroom suddenly felt much quieter, much heavier. Finally, I forced a smile. That was a long time ago. Robert studied me carefully. Then he glanced toward the stage, toward Daniel, toward Vanessa. When he looked back at me, there was concern in his eyes. Not pity, concern. I overheard the introduction earlier. There it was, the moment neither of us had mentioned. Until now. I gave a small nod. Then I'm apparently the babysitter. A faint smile touched his lips. No. He paused. I know that's what they called you. The distinction mattered. More than I expected. For the first time that evening, someone was acknowledging what had happened without pretending it was harmless, without laughing, without excusing it. Robert folded his hands on the table. I've watched Daniel's career for years. That surprised me. I had always assumed executives operated far above my son's level. Apparently not. He's talented, Robert continued. Very talented. I nodded. He works hard. Yes, he does. Something about his tone suggested there was more he wasn't saying. I waited. Eventually, he continued. But talent isn't what makes people memorable. I looked at him curiously. What does? His answer came without hesitation. Character. The word hung between us. Character. Not success. Not money. Not titles. Character. Robert glanced toward the stage again. The evening's program was moving toward the next speaker. More applause. More congratulations. More celebration. Yet I had the feeling he wasn't paying attention to any of it. Neither was I. After a moment, he asked quietly, "Do you mind if I ask you something?" Not at all. When was the last time you visited Daniel's office? I thought about it, then realized I didn't know. 3 years. Maybe 4. Possibly longer. Robert seemed unsurprised by my answer. That unsettled me, because it meant he already suspected it, maybe even knew it. Before I could ask what he meant, another executive approached our table. "Robert, they're looking for you backstage." Robert stood. The executive left. Before walking away, Robert turned back toward me. "There are things people in this room should remember tonight." His eyes briefly shifted toward the stage, then back to me. "And sometimes they just need a little help remembering." I wasn't entirely sure what he meant, but something in his expression made my heart beat faster. This wasn't a casual conversation anymore. This wasn't simply kindness from a stranger. Robert knew something important. As he walked away, I looked toward the stage where Daniel stood, smiling beneath the bright lights. For the first time all evening, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Confidence. But underneath it, nervousness. And suddenly I found myself wondering whether Daniel had seen Robert sitting with me. Because if he had, the look on his face suggested he understood exactly why that conversation mattered. I couldn't stop thinking about the look on Daniel's face. It appeared only for a second, a brief flicker, the kind most people would never notice. But mothers notice things. We always do, especially when we've spent decades reading a child's emotions before they ever learned how to hide them. The confident executive standing on stage wasn't the little boy I raised. Yet for one brief moment, I saw him again. The nervous teenager who used to glance toward me whenever he was afraid. The boy who once believed I could solve any problem. The thought stayed with me as the program continued. One executive after another stepped up to the microphone. They praised Daniel's leadership, his work ethic, his ability to manage teams, his vision for the company's future. Each compliment was met with applause. and each round of applause seemed to make Vanessa smile a little wider. She looked radiant, proud, victorious. From a distance, they looked like the perfect couple. The kind people admire, the kind people envy. I remembered thinking exactly that when Daniel first introduced her to me. It had been nearly 15 years ago. She arrived at my house carrying a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers. Beautiful, polite, charming. She called me Mrs. Parker during dinner. By dessert, she was calling me Eleanor. At the time, I thought it was modern. Friendly. I didn't realize it was the beginning of something else. The first small step in creating distance. Not enough to seem rude, just enough to establish boundaries. Over the years, there were many moments like that. Tiny moments, easy to dismiss, easy to excuse. The first Thanksgiving after they married, Vanessa insisted on hosting. I was relieved. After years of cooking, the idea of someone else handling the holiday sounded wonderful. A week before Thanksgiving, she called. "We're keeping things small this year." I understood, or at least I thought I did. Then, a few days later, photos appeared online. A full dining room, friends, neighbors, extended family. Everyone was there except me. Daniel later claimed there had been a misunderstanding. I accepted the explanation, because that's what mothers do. We accept explanations we would never believe from anyone else. Another memory surfaced. Sophie's 8th birthday. I arrived carrying the bicycle she'd been asking for, only to discover the party had started 2 hours earlier. Vanessa smiled apologetically. "We thought Daniel told you." He insisted he had. Neither of them seemed concerned that I'd missed most of the celebration. At the time, I convinced myself it was an accident. Sitting in that ballroom now, I wasn't so sure. The memories kept coming. Christmas dinners, school events, family vacations I learned about afterward. Always small enough to explain, never large enough to confront. Like drops of water slowly wearing away stone. Eventually, you don't notice what's happening until the damage is done. A burst of applause pulled me back to the present. Daniel was returning to his seat. Vanessa immediately reached for his hand. They exchanged a smile. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel looked toward the back of the room, toward my table, toward me. Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us looked away. I wanted to see guilt, regret, something. Instead, I saw uncertainty, as though he wasn't entirely comfortable with the way the evening had unfolded, as though part of him understood something had gone wrong. The moment lasted only a second. Then Vanessa leaned toward him and whispered something. Immediately, he turned away. The connection disappeared. Just like that. I looked down at my untouched champagne. The bubbles were gone now. Flat. Silent. I suddenly realized I hadn't taken a single sip. A strange sadness settled over me. Not because of what Vanessa had called me. Not even because of where I was seated. What hurt most was understanding how gradually this had happened. No dramatic argument. No major betrayal. Just years of being moved a little farther away. A little farther. And a little farther. Until one day, people no longer remembered where I belonged. I thought about Robert's words. Talent isn't what makes people memorable. Character does. The sentence lingered in my mind. Because Robert wasn't talking only about Daniel. He was talking about everyone in the room. Maybe even me. As I sat there, reflecting, I noticed movement near the stage. Several executives were gathering for the final portion of the evening. The company's leadership team, including Robert. A large screen behind them displayed photographs from different stages of Daniel's career. College graduation, early company events, award ceremonies, years of success displayed in a carefully curated timeline. The audience watched attentively. Then one photograph appeared that made my breath catch. It was old, very old. Daniel couldn't have been more than 18. Standing beside him was a woman wearing a simple blue dress. Her hair was darker back then, her smile nervous, her hands clasped tightly together. It took me a second to realize who I was looking at. Me. The room remained focused on the screen. Most people probably didn't think much of it, but Robert did. Because from across the ballroom, I saw him glance toward me, then toward Daniel. And suddenly I had the feeling that photograph wasn't included by accident. Not tonight. Not after everything that had happened. And for the first time all evening, I sensed that someone was about to remind the room exactly who that woman in the photograph was. The photograph remained on the screen for only a few seconds. Then it disappeared, replaced by another image, then another. The audience continued watching the presentation. Most people probably never gave it a second thought, but I couldn't stop staring at the screen. At the woman standing beside 18-year-old Daniel, the woman who looked exhausted and hopeful at the same time, the woman who had spent years wondering whether all the sacrifices would someday be worth it. I barely recognized her, yet I remembered exactly how she felt. Back then, every dollar mattered. Every hour mattered. Every decision mattered. I remembered working double shifts at the library during the day and helping organize community events at night. I remembered eating simple meals for weeks because Daniel needed textbooks. I remembered repairing the same washing machine 3 times because replacing it wasn't an option. Life had never been easy, but I never regretted any of it. Not once. The room erupted into applause as another executive finished speaking. I forced myself back into the present. The evening was moving toward its final segment, the promotion ceremony, the official recognition, the reason everyone had gathered. Several employees stood near the stage preparing awards and plaques. Waiters moved quietly through the ballroom collecting empty glasses. Around me, conversations grew louder. People were relaxed now. The formal speeches were nearly over. I noticed Daniel speaking with a group of senior executives near the front. Vanessa remained close to his side, always smiling, always managing the room. She seemed particularly interested in who was speaking to whom, who mattered, who didn't. More than once, I caught her glancing toward my table, not long enough to attract attention, just long enough to check whether I was still sitting quietly in the corner. I was. And I think that made her comfortable, because people rarely worry about someone they've already dismissed. A few minutes later, a young server approached. "Mrs. Parker?" I looked up in surprise. Very few people here knew my last name. "Yes?" He handed me a small envelope. "This was left for you." Before I could ask who sent it, he was already moving toward another table. Curious, I turned the envelope over. No name, no message, just a simple, cream-colored envelope. I opened it carefully. Inside was a folded card. Only one sentence had been written. "Please stay until the very end." That was all. No signature. No explanation. I read it twice. Then a third time. My first instinct was that it came from Robert. The timing certainly suggested it, but I couldn't be certain. Part of me wanted to leave. The evening had already become more painful than I expected. I felt tired. Emotionally tired, the kind of exhaustion that settles deep inside your chest. Yet something told me to stay. So I slipped the card into my purse and remained seated. A few minutes later, another familiar face appeared beside my table. Sophia, my granddaughter. At 16, she had grown taller than I remembered. Teenagers seem to do that overnight. One day, they're children. The next, they're nearly adults. "Grandma." A smile spread across my face immediately. No matter what had happened tonight, seeing Sophia always made me happy. "Hello, sweetheart." She leaned down and hugged me. A real hug. Not rushed. Not distracted. For a moment, I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. "I've been looking for you. I've been here the whole time." Her smile faded slightly. "I know." The way she said it made me pause. Sophia glanced toward the front of the room where her parents were talking with guests, then back at me. "Are you okay?" Such a simple question, yet it nearly broke my heart, because she was the first person all evening who had asked it. I nodded gently. "I'm fine." She didn't look convinced. Teenagers are often more observant than adults realize. After a brief silence, she lowered her voice. I heard what Mom said earlier. There it was, the sentence both of us had been avoiding. I saw embarrassment flash across her face. Then sadness. I was standing near the bar. For a second, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said quietly, I didn't think it was funny. My throat tightened. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You don't need to worry about it. Yes, I do. Her answer came faster than I expected. She looked almost angry. Not at me. At the situation. At the unfairness of it. I told Mom she shouldn't have said that. I blinked. You did? Sophia nodded. She said I was overreacting. The words didn't surprise me. Not really. Still, hearing them hurt, because it confirmed something I had spent years trying not to believe. Vanessa knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't thoughtlessness. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was intentional. Sophia glanced toward the stage. They're about to announce the final award. Then she looked back at me. Something unusual appeared in her expression, almost like anticipation, almost like she knew something. Before I could ask, she smiled. A small, mysterious smile. Then she gave my hand one last squeeze. Don't leave early, Grandma. The exact same message that had been written on the card. My heart skipped. Why? Sophia's smile widened. You'll see. Then she turned and walked away. I watched her disappear into the crowd. And for the second time that evening, I found myself hearing the same advice. Stay until the end. Whatever was about to happen, more than one person seemed to know it was coming. And suddenly, for the first time all night, I wasn't the only one waiting. I stayed exactly where I was. The card remained inside my purse. Sophia's words echoed in my mind. Don't leave early, Grandma. For the first time all evening, curiosity had begun to replace disappointment. Not completely. The hurt was still there, still sitting quietly inside me. But now there was something else, a feeling that pieces were moving beneath the surface, pieces I couldn't yet see. The ballroom lights dimmed once again. A gentle chime sounded through the speakers. Conversations gradually faded. People returned to their tables. The final portion of the evening was about to begin. I watched as Daniel made his way toward the stage. He looked confident again. The uncertainty I'd noticed earlier had disappeared. At least on the surface. Vanessa followed close behind. Her smile was flawless. She adjusted Daniel's tie, touched his arm, whispered something in his ear. He nodded. From a distance, they looked perfect, like the kind of couple featured in corporate magazines. Successful, polished, admired. The audience applauded as the master of ceremonies stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. The room grew quiet. We have one final recognition before the evening concludes. A large plaque rested on an easel beside the stage. Gold lettering reflected the lights overhead. Several photographers moved into position. The atmosphere shifted. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The promotion was no longer simply an announcement. It was becoming part of the company's history. I noticed Robert Whitmore standing near the side of the stage. His expression remained calm, focused. Every now and then, his gaze drifted across the ballroom, as though he was waiting for something, or someone. The MC continued speaking. He listed Daniel's accomplishments, major projects, revenue growth, leadership awards. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause. None of it surprised me. Daniel had always been ambitious. Even as a child, I remembered him selling homemade lemonade in front of our house one summer. Most children wanted enough money for candy. Daniel wanted enough money to buy another table so he could open a second lemonade stand. The memory made me smile. Some parts of him had never changed. Yet somewhere along the way, other parts had. The applause ended. Daniel stepped forward to accept the award. Camera flashes filled the room. Vanessa looked delighted, proud, victorious. I expected the evening to end there. Award, speech, more applause. Then everyone goes home. But Robert suddenly stepped toward the microphone. A subtle movement, yet it immediately changed the atmosphere. The audience quieted again. Even Daniel seemed surprised. The CEO rarely spoke at events like this without notice. Robert smiled warmly. Before we conclude tonight, I'd like to share something. The room became completely silent. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Robert glanced at Daniel, then toward the audience, then, unexpectedly, toward the back of the ballroom, toward my table, only for a moment. But I noticed. So did Daniel. The smile on my son's face faltered, just slightly. Robert continued. When people celebrate success, they often focus on the person standing in the spotlight. Several guests nodded. That's understandable. A few quiet laughs followed. But the truth is, no one reaches the spotlight alone. Something shifted inside the room. The speech no longer sounded like a standard corporate message. People began listening more carefully. Robert spoke slowly, the way people do when every word matters. Behind every achievement, there are sacrifices that rarely appear in annual reports. Silence. People who work without recognition. More silence. People who give without expecting anything in return. I felt my chest tighten. Around me, guests remained focused on the stage. No one checked their phones. No one whispered. Even the waitstaff seemed to pause. Robert looked toward Daniel again. When Daniel first came into this company, he impressed everyone. The audience applauded. Daniel smiled politely, but the tension in his shoulders had become visible now, at least to me. Robert continued. I remember meeting him years before that. The room remained attentive. He was a young man with enormous potential. Another pause. And behind that young man stood someone extraordinary. My fingers tightened around my handbag. Something told me I already knew where this was going. Across the room, I noticed Vanessa shift uncomfortably. The confidence she had carried all evening seemed to flicker, just briefly. But it was there. Robert turned toward the large screen behind him. A photograph appeared. The same photograph from earlier. 18-year-old Daniel, standing beside a woman in a simple blue dress. Me. A murmur moved through the audience. People looked from the screen back to Daniel, then back to the screen, trying to understand, trying to connect the pieces. Robert smiled. I've kept this photograph for 15 years. Now the room was completely still. No one was looking at Daniel anymore. No one was looking at Vanessa. They were all looking at the image. And for the first time all evening, I realized something important. The story Vanessa had carefully built was beginning to crack. Not because I exposed it, not because I defended myself, but because the truth had quietly walked into the room long before any of us arrived. And now it was finally stepping into the light. The ballroom was silent. Not the polite silence that follows a speech. Not the distracted silence of people waiting for dessert. This was different. The kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes they're witnessing something unexpected. On the giant screen behind Robert Whitmore remained that old photograph. Daniel at 18. And me. A younger version of me. My hair darker. My face less lined. Standing proudly beside my son on one of the most important days of his young life. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Robert smiled. I remember that evening very well. His voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom. It was a scholarship fundraiser. A few people nodded politely. Most were still trying to understand why the company's CEO was talking about a photograph from 15 years ago. Robert glanced toward the screen. Daniel gave a speech that night. I felt my throat tighten. I remembered every word. Not because it was extraordinary, because it came from my son. Back then, that was enough. Robert continued. He spoke about hard work. POWs. He spoke about opportunity. Another pause. And then he spent nearly 10 minutes talking about his mother. A ripple moved through the room. Several guests turned toward me. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. I suddenly became aware of dozens of eyes. The same people who had ignored me earlier. The same people who believed I was the babysitter. Robert smiled. I still remember what he said. Daniel stood perfectly still. The award remained in his hands. But I could see tension building beneath his expression. Robert looked directly at him. You said your mother worked 2 jobs after your father passed away. Silence. You said she sold things she loved so you could stay in school. Silence. You said every success you achieved belonged to her as much as it belonged to you. The room felt frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Across the ballroom, I saw Vanessa's smile slowly disappear. For the first time all evening, she looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Robert turned toward the audience. You know, in business, we spend a lot of time discussing leadership. A few executives nodded. But leadership begins long before someone receives a title. His gaze drifted toward me. It begins with the people who teach us sacrifice. My eyes burned. Not because I wanted attention. I didn't. I never had. What overwhelmed me was hearing someone remember. Someone remember the things I had quietly accepted as forgotten. The years. The sacrifices. The choices. All the invisible pieces of motherhood. Robert smiled again. Then he said something I would never forget. The woman sitting in the back of this ballroom is not a babysitter. The words landed like thunder. Several people visibly turned in their chairs. Others exchanged confused looks. A few glanced toward Vanessa. A few toward Daniel. Nobody knew where to look. Robert pointed gently toward my table. That woman is Eleanor Parker. The room remained completely silent. She is the reason Daniel had opportunities many people only dream about. I lowered my eyes, suddenly feeling exposed, not embarrassed, just overwhelmed, because this was never supposed to be about me. Yet somehow it was. Robert continued, I've met thousands of employees during my career. He paused, but I never forgot Daniel's speech. His voice softened, because I never forgot how proudly he spoke about his mother. The sentence hit harder than anything else. Not because Robert said it, because it reminded me of someone Daniel used to be. Before promotions, before titles, before appearances became more important than relationships, the Daniel I raised would have been horrified by what happened earlier. The realization hurt, but it also brought something else. Hope. Because maybe that person wasn't completely gone. Maybe he was simply buried beneath years of ambition and pressure. The room remained focused on the stage. No one cared about the award anymore. No one cared about the corporate celebration. They cared about the story, the human story. And everyone suddenly understood they had only heard half of it. I looked toward Daniel. For the first time all evening, our eyes met again. This time, he didn't look away. The confidence was gone. The executive was gone. For a brief moment, I saw my son. And what I saw in his eyes wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. It was regret. Deep regret. The kind that arrives when a person realizes how far they've drifted from who they once were. Then something unexpected happened. A voice came from the front row. A woman's voice. Clear enough for everyone to hear. Wait. The entire room turned. It was Jennifer Ross, one of Daniel's senior colleagues. She looked genuinely stunned. Then she looked at me and asked the question that changed everything. You mean that's Daniel's mother? The silence that followed felt even heavier than before, because now the truth wasn't simply being revealed. People were beginning to understand exactly how much had been hidden. Jennifer's question seemed to hang in the air. You mean that's Daniel's mother? No one answered immediately. Not Daniel. Not Vanessa. Not even Robert. For a few seconds, the entire ballroom remained perfectly still, It was remarkable how quickly a room could change. Less than an hour earlier, people had smiled politely and accepted the explanation that I was the babysitter. Now they were staring at me as if they were seeing me for the first time. Perhaps they were. Jennifer looked from Robert to Daniel, then back to me. "I had no idea," she said quietly. Several other employees nodded. One man near the front shook his head. "Neither did I." Another voice joined in. "I thought his mother lived out of state." Someone else added, "I heard she wasn't involved in his life anymore." A murmur spread through the room. Not loud, just enough to reveal something important. Over the years, a story had been created. A story about me. A story that apparently many people believed. And none of it was true. I looked toward Daniel. His face had grown pale. Not dramatically, just enough for a mother to notice. For the first time that evening, he seemed completely unsure of himself. The award still rested in his hands, but it no longer looked important. Nothing looked important anymore. Robert allowed the room a moment to absorb everything. Then he spoke again. "I think many people here are learning something tonight." A few quiet laughs followed. The tension eased slightly, but only slightly, because everyone knew there was more beneath the surface. Jennifer stood from her seat. "I've worked with Daniel for 7 years." She looked genuinely confused. "And this is honestly the first time I've ever heard anyone mention his mother." The statement wasn't cruel. It wasn't an accusation. That somehow made it more powerful, because it was honest. The kind of honest observation that becomes impossible to ignore once it's spoken aloud. Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. One executive nodded slowly. "Same here." Another added, "I always assumed his parents were gone." The room grew quiet again. Across the ballroom, I saw Vanessa staring at the floor. The confidence she carried all evening had disappeared. For years, she had carefully managed appearances. Tonight, appearances were slipping away. Not because someone attacked her, because reality was quietly replacing the story. Robert folded his hands. When people rise professionally, they often feel pressure. The room listened carefully. Pressure to fit in. A few executives smiled knowingly. Pressure to appear successful. More nods. Pressure to distance themselves from anything that reminds them where they started. No names were mentioned. No accusations made. Yet everyone understood, including Daniel. Especially Daniel. I noticed him lower his eyes. For a brief moment, he looked less like an executive and more like the young man from the photograph. The young man who once spoke proudly about his mother. The young man who wasn't ashamed of where he came from. A movement near the front caught my attention. Sophia had returned. She stood beside one of the tables, watching quietly. Her eyes moved between her father and me. Then something unexpected happened. She raised her hand. Not dramatically. Not for attention. Simply because she wanted to speak. The room fell silent once more. Daniel looked surprised. "Sweetheart." Sophia swallowed nervously. Then looked directly at Robert. "May I say something?" Robert smiled warmly. "Of course." Every eye in the ballroom shifted toward her. Sophia took a deep breath. At 16, she suddenly looked much younger. Just a granddaughter trying to do the right thing. "That's my grandmother." Her voice trembled slightly, but she kept going. "She's not our babysitter." No one interrupted. No one moved. "She's the person who taught me how to bake cookies." A few smiles appeared around the room. "She came to every school play." More smiles. "She never forgot my birthday." My eyes immediately filled with tears. Not because of the attention, because of the sincerity. Children often see things adults miss. Sophia wasn't talking about status, or titles, or success. She was talking about love. The kind that doesn't appear on resumes. The kind that cannot be measured. Sophia looked toward her father, then toward her mother. Her voice softened. "And she's the reason I know what family is supposed to feel like." The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. People simply sat there, thinking, reflecting, understanding. Across the room, I saw several guests quietly wiping their eyes. Others looked away, uncomfortable with their own emotions. I looked toward Daniel again. This time, there was no uncertainty left in his face, only regret, the kind that comes when the truth arrives in front of hundreds of witnesses. And for the first time all evening, it seemed he finally understood what had been lost. Not his reputation, not his promotion, something far more valuable. A relationship, a mother, a part of himself he had spent years pushing into the shadows. And judging by the expression on his face, he had just realized how much that decision had cost him. For several seconds after Sophia finished speaking, no one moved. The ballroom remained completely silent. Not awkward, not uncomfortable, just quiet in the way a room becomes quiet when people are forced to look at something real. Sophia slowly returned to her seat. As she passed my table, she gave me a small smile, the same smile she used to give me when she was little and wanted me to know everything would be okay. I smiled back. Then I looked toward Daniel. My son stood motionless near the stage. The award was still in his hands. The promotion was still real. The success was still his. Yet, somehow, none of those things seemed important anymore. For the first time that evening, he wasn't surrounded by applause. He wasn't hiding behind a title. He wasn't standing beside executives. He was simply a son facing the truth. Robert quietly stepped away from the microphone. He didn't need to say anything else. Neither did anyone else. The truth had already been spoken. The room understood. Slowly, Daniel walked toward the microphone. No one stopped him. No one spoke. Every eye followed him. I felt my heart beating faster. Not because I expected a dramatic speech. Not because I wanted revenge. I didn't. I never had. I simply wanted to know whether the boy I raised was still somewhere inside the man standing before me. Daniel took a breath, then another. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different. Less polished, more human. I've spent most of my career learning how to lead people. He paused. But tonight I realized I failed someone who mattered far more than any job title. The room remained silent. I could see him searching for words. Real words. Not corporate ones. Not rehearsed ones. The kind that are difficult to say because they cost something. Finally, he looked directly at me. And for the first time all evening, he didn't look away. Mom. The word hit me harder than I expected. Not Eleanor. Not an introduction. Not a convenient label. Mom. A few people quietly lowered their eyes. Others watched without moving. Daniel swallowed. I don't know when I started caring so much about appearances. His voice trembled slightly. But somewhere along the way, I forgot the person who made all of this possible. He glanced around the ballroom, at the executives, the guests, the award, the celebration. Then back to me. You worked harder than anyone I know. I felt tears forming, not because of the attention, because I recognized the sincerity, the honesty, the Daniel I remembered, the one who used to sit at our kitchen table dreaming about a better future. You never asked for credit. His voice cracked. You never asked for recognition. The room remained perfectly still. And tonight, you deserved both. A tear slipped down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. For years, I had imagined conversations like this. Confrontations, explanations, arguments. But standing there, listening to my son, I realized something important. The pain was never about being called a babysitter. Not really. The pain came from feeling forgotten, feeling invisible, feeling as though all the years we shared had somehow been erased. And now, for the first time in a very long time, I no longer felt invisible. Daniel stepped away from the microphone. Then, to the surprise of everyone in the room, he walked directly toward me. The ballroom watched in silence. When he reached my table, He stopped. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he wrapped his arms around me, the same way he used to when he was young, the same way he did after his father's funeral, the same way he did whenever life became too heavy. I hugged him back, not because everything was suddenly fixed. Life doesn't work that way. Trust takes time. Healing takes time. Families are complicated. But forgiveness begins with truth. And tonight, truth had finally entered the room. When Daniel stepped back, his eyes were wet. Mine were too. Neither of us pretended otherwise. A moment later, Sophia joined us. Then, after a brief hesitation, Vanessa approached. She looked different than she had earlier that evening. Smaller somehow. Less certain. She quietly apologized. Not to the room. Not for appearances. To May. And while some wounds take time to heal, I appreciated that she tried. That was enough for tonight. The evening ended shortly afterward. Guests slowly made their way home. Conversation softened. The lights dimmed. The celebration finally came to an end. As I walked toward the exit, I passed the large screen one final time. The photograph was still there. Young Daniel and me, standing side by side. Neither of us perfect. Neither of us important in the eyes of the world. But together, I stopped for a moment and smiled. Earlier that evening, they had introduced me as the babysitter. For a little while, I thought that was the most painful thing that could happen. I was wrong. The most painful thing is being forgotten by the people you love. And the most beautiful thing is being remembered. As I stepped out into the cool night air, Daniel and Sophia walked beside me. The city lights reflected across the river. The future was still uncertain. Families rarely become perfect overnight. But for the first time in years, we were walking in the same direction. And somehow, that felt like enough. Because in the end, they introduced me as the babysitter. But by the end of the night, everyone knew exactly who I was. I wasn't the babysitter. I wasn't an embarrassment. I wasn't someone to hide. I was a mother. And that was more than enough. Looking back on that night, I learned that success means very little if it costs you the people who helped you achieve it. For years, I believed love and sacrifice would always be remembered. But sometimes, they quietly fade beneath ambition and appearances. What matters is not how others choose to introduce you, but knowing your own worth when they forget. In the end, the truth didn't need me to defend it. It simply needed time to be seen. And I walked away with something far more valuable than recognition. I got my son back.